All right, welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Subro Sessions. I'm Matt Ferrie. I'm a partner in the subrogation department here at White & Williams, and I love being involved with our Subro Sessions podcast. As Subro Sessions continues to expand in its content, this will be the first episode in a series of episodes that we're going to be doing about investigating residential electrical fires. We're fortunate to have as our guest for this series forensic engineer Bert Davis. Bert is a principal for Romauldi, Davidson and Associates, as well as for BDA Engineering. Both of those companies are based in the Pittsburgh area. My department thinks very highly of Bert's expertise, and we've utilized his services in many cases. Bert, if you could please say hi to our tens of thousands of listeners, and by tens of thousands, I mean less than that.
Hello, I'm Bert Davis. I'm a principal at Romauldi Davidson Associates, or RDA Engineering.
We felt that investigating residential electrical fires is a great topic for a series of podcast episodes, not only because residential electrical fires certainly make up a significant amount of property damage subrogation cases, but also because there's some nuance to them that is not always well understood, and there are some misconceptions we would like to address as well. Almost any investigation of a suspected residential electrical fire is going to involve a fire origin and cause investigator and an electrical engineer. Now, Bert, you have more letters after your name than I have in my name. You are a PhD, a PE, a CFEI, a CFII, and an LEED-AP. You're also a licensed mechanical and electrical contractor, among other things. What I'd like to focus on are just a few of your specializations at the moment, as I think one of the great things about utilizing you in a fire investigation is that you're qualified as both an electrical engineer and a mechanical engineer, as well as being qualified as a fire origin and cause investigator. Now, in a typical residential electrical fire, how reliant is the electrical engineer on the origin and cause investigator, and why?
We are reliant on the origin and cause investigator. Usually they're at the scene first. They will define the fire origin or attempt to define the fire origin. Typically, before we're there, they will have interviewed multiple people, some of which may be witnesses, and they're able to begin the process of looking at what was in the potential area of origin. They may also provide some opinions on what they feel is the cause of the fire and what brought the source of ignition and fuel load together. So it's great to have a fire origin and cause person there to define the scene and help with the investigation.
Now, Bert, when you're conducting a fire investigation, do you expect NFPA 921, which many of our listeners know is the National Fire Protection Association Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigations, do you expect that to be the methodology that is used at a fire investigation?
So, as we've discussed at other seminars, it's not a code, but it does define what most fire investigators, if not all, use as a handbook to define how they should proceed with the investigation, how they would handle evidence. And it also gives a lot of subject matter in different areas of fire investigation, including electrical fires and other types of fires.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you obtained your qualifications as both a mechanical engineer and an electrical engineer, as well as a cause and origin investigator? And how have those specializations assisted you in your investigations?
Well, I have done a lot of construction related work. I started out at Carnegie Mellon University in their Department of Design and Construction, where I managed a crew of electricians, plumbers, HVAC technicians, and carpenters. And I would normally go out and troubleshoot problems at the university and then prepare design for their repair. I also had the opportunity to work at a design build mechanical electrical firm where I both designed mechanical and electrical systems, had to go out and troubleshoot those systems, occasionally repair those systems. So I got quite a bit of hands-on experience in these areas, both as a technician and as a design engineer.
And in terms of the degrees that you have in which of these fields, how would you describe that?
Well, my bachelor's was in mechanical, and then my master's was in civil structural. I then got a grant from the National Renewable Energy Laboratories to work on renewable energy systems and integrating them into the electric grid. And the reason they used me for that was because I did have some electrical, mechanical, structural background, and we were putting essentially renewable energy systems on buildings that had to support them, and then model those buildings with these electrical systems and look how they would interact with the electric grid in producing energy from the sun. Essentially, it was a renewable energy system.
When did you obtain your training and certification as a origin and cause investigator?
I would have obtained that probably 25 years ago or 30 years ago. At Romauldi Davidson, when I started, we had Jim Warren, who was the head of the electrical investigation department. And he essentially trained me, and I actually helped him quite a bit with appliance fires because I had worked on gas systems and some electrical systems that he was not familiar with. And that's really how I got started. I was asked to look at a few fires that involved equipment I had installed and serviced, and I was very familiar with it. And some of the forensic engineers who had not done this type of work, actually serviced the equipment or designed it, relied on my expertise for determining the issue and doing whatever field work was necessary to test that equipment.
Well, it's a great diversity of experience that you have. When you're at a fire scene, do you prefer to act as your own origin and cause investigator or to have a separate origin and cause investigator, and why?
Normally, I prefer if there's a separate origin and cause investigator so we can collaborate. There's times when, for example, uh, it's a very difficult origin to pinpoint, and we both have to look at the scene and try and look at things like arc mapping, which we can talk about at another time, fire dynamics, fire patterns. Normally, the O&C will do quite a few interviews, which are time consuming, and relay those back to me. So we'll look at the various aspects of fire investigation and then work together to come to some reasonable conclusion.
And I think you're kind of foreshadowing my next question here, which is basically, have you had any scenarios where there's another origin and cause investigator involved with the party who retained you, and you disagree with them about what the area of origin is based on your own experience, and how have you handled those situations?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say the answer is yes, but normally we'll discuss the fire patterns, fire dynamics, potential cause, ignition cause. It just so happens electrical is a type of fire that is often blamed as a cause, but oftentimes is not the cause. So even if I have an origin that may look like it's near or at an electrical appliance, electrical wiring, one has to determine if the failure, A, if it occurred, and B, is it of sufficient temperature and time to ignite the combustible materials?
So is it typically a more of a collaborative process if there's initial disagreement about the area of origin?
Absolutely.
So we can't really talk about investigating residential electrical fires without understanding how the residential electrical system works. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I'm going to go over that briefly. We have the electrical production of power that goes over what they call transmission lines, that comes into a substation, and that goes to distribution lines. Those are the lines that you're typically seeing at or near your house. And then if you have an above ground electrical system, you'll see a pole mounted transformer. Out of that transformer, we have what we call 120 240 volts, which has three wires going over to the home. That then drops into a electric meter at a meter socket and then enters the panel at the home. What's important to note is the power system has two phase conductors and a neutral, and we often say that the voltage between the phase conductors is 240, and from each phase conductor or hot conductor to the neutral or ground is 120. From the panel, we'll have branch circuits that go out to equipment and devices such as receptacles and switches, and those are protected by circuit breakers.
What factors must be present for a residential electrical fire to occur?
Well, I'd like to, in this case, answer this regarding wiring systems. whether it be the structural wiring, which is in the walls typically, or in the floor system, but can also include extension cords. Normally, with our structural wiring, the circuit breaker protection will activate so quickly that even though our temperatures are thousands of degrees, the time isn't there to ignite most items, such as structural wood flooring. In fact, when we give a class on this, and we've given many classes, we'll allow students to cause these electrical faults, look at the arcs, and we delay the occurrence of the arc by adding resistance in the circuit, and we still can't ignite most structural materials. Now, unlike your structural wiring, extension cords and wiring to, let's say, a lamp may be very small in size, and it may not allow the breaker to actuate. And that's a much more profound type of failure, which often can result in a fire. The structural wiring for a fire to occur, normally we'll look at breakers. Sometimes they fail to operate. Breakers are mechanical devices, they're not exercised. And if they're in a wet basement for 50 years, they may not actuate. When a breaker doesn't actuate, you'll actually get arcing that extends for a significant amount of time. And it'll typically show up with some wiring vaporized by the arcing and damage to the breaker. Another issue would be, for example, somebody has a very small wire, like a number 14 wire. And I've seen in one case where somebody had a 100 amp breaker on that circuit. When they had a failure of the wiring, the breaker just didn't trip. And again, the arcing went on for some time and ignited combustible materials. So,
Bert, just in that specific scenario, would that be an example of the wrong type of breaker being installed rather than the breaker not functioning as intended?
correct. The wrong breaker for the wiring. When you see structural wiring causing a fire, we're normally looking for a cause or something that went wrong, whether it be a product failure, an installation failure, or something that didn't permit this overcurrent protection or circuit breaker to operate properly.
So it sounds like, with based on what you're describing, we're having these electrical events, these arcs that are creating certainly significant enough ignition temperatures to start a fire. But another key factor is actually the time duration where that ignition temperature exists. Would that be right?
That's correct. For every fire, we look at the heat source. Does it have sufficient temperature and time? Essentially, you're looking at energy imparted into the material. And then you have to look at the material itself and make some determination whether that time and temperature scenario is adequate for the material to cause that to essentially ignite.
Now, sometimes you'll conduct a scene examination before the actual joint scene examination with parties that were placed on notice. And sometimes the joint scene examination is going to be your first time on site. Do you have a preference between these two scenarios? And can you walk us through how you conduct your scene examination in each of these scenarios?
So in both of these examples, well, first let me go back to the preference. Any fire that has significant damage or there is some difficulty in determining origin and cause, in my opinion, should have an examination prior to joint, particularly if the fire investigator is thinking that 5 or 6 different items may be involved. We may be able to narrow that down considerably. And then we don't have 20 people in examination. Also, if it's a fire that is difficult to determine causation, we may be able to do that at this pre joint exam where we collaborate on our opinions, and then I can have a better idea whether or not there's a product failure or something else accidental or even non accidental. So, in most cases, pre joint would be expected and it would be helpful. There are very simple fires where it just does not make sense to do that, though.
Right, of course. So, what about your process at a scene examination?
So, normally, when I get to the fire, I will meet with the O&C, review their findings, review the fire patterns. And once I review this, we'll discuss how the fire occurred by using the fire pattern analysis, something called fire dynamics, and how the heat spreads. We may use arc mapping, and in some cases, witness statements. And once we do that, we'll look at the one or more heat sources of ignition and determine if they were adequate, and then look at various aspects of the electrical system, such as the electrical service, the panel, the branch wiring, the breakers, and other things that may have been involved in the fire.
So sometimes you will see a subrogation attorney or subrogation attorneys at these joint scene exams. What do you think the subrogation attorney's role should be at these exams?
Well, in some cases, their role should be to give us some background that may just include the insurance claim and what they learned prior to the investigation. A lot of times it's to make the subrogation attorney familiar with what's going on, how we came to our findings, and give them a good understanding of the fire. And once that occurs, we can then have a very good conversation post fire about the findings.
I don't know if you remember, there used to be a great show on TV called House MD. He was a brilliant doctor. He specialized in infectious diseases. And one of his quirks was that he never wanted to speak to his patients because he thought that they always lied, whether because of embarrassment or other reasons. He preferred to rely solely on the physical symptoms and any medical testing in making his diagnoses. How important do you find witness interviews to be in your investigations? And what if the witness information you receive conflicts with the physical evidence you're observing?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that when I'm dealing with fire marshals, police, and those type of individuals, they typically want a fire proved without the witness statement. So if a witness says, I did X and it started the fire, they would like me to look at X, verify that yes, X did start the fire. One of the issues with witness statements are, unless it's very early in the fire when it first begins, they may come into a fire and see a fuel load that's ignited and assume that that's the cause of the fire and say it was a failure of X, when in fact that's not true. There was some other failure that caused the large fuel package to ignite. And I've actually run into that, particularly with what they call fire dynamics, where the flow of heat, let's say through a broken window, makes one area look much more damaged than another area. A witness puts it there when the fire actually occurred somewhere else.
It's interesting you mentioned that because I think the scenario you're talking about, it's not even a witness lying. It's actually a witness who thinks they're correct and is actually making a well-meaning mistake, right?
Correct. And we've had fires where that's occurred. We've had the witness put a fire at X, and then once we process the fire scene, we actually find out that it didn't occur there. And the item they thought that was the first, what I'll call fuel ignited, was not the first fuel ignited.
For basically every house fire investigation that I've been involved in where the suspected cause is electrical, the origin and cause investigator or the electrical engineer will tell me which breakers were tripped in the main electrical panel of the home. Please tell us why that is important to the investigation.
So the breakers trip due to electrical current flowing where it shouldn't go. For example, what we call the phase or the hot conductor arcs to the neutral conductor. It's causing the breaker to trip from a fault condition. Typically, it's called arcing. We look at that to go back and determine where the arcs occurred, which may help with the origin of determination. But in a lot of cases, for example, let's say we think a dryer caused a fire. Do we have electrical activity inside that dryer, or is it on the dryer cord? They're two different things. If heat attacks the dryer, it's on the cord. If I have the failure in the dryer, it's likely inside the dryer. We also want to verify that, for example, electric dryer, it's a 30 amp 2-pole breaker. That breaker tripped, and just go through the electrical system to verify that our theory can be supported by the breaker tripping and the wiring being correctly sized and things of that nature. For example, if I have a 100 amp breaker on a dryer for some reason, which you could obviously put on there if you wanted to, and I have arcing in the dryer, if I had a correctly sized breaker, that may not cause a fire. So we always want to look at the failure, the breakers, the wiring, and A, verify why the fire occurred, and B, that the overcurrent protection and wiring were correct.
So we've talked a bit about arcing. Two other terms that I hear often from origin and cause investigators or electrical engineers are beating and electrical activity. Can you talk a little bit about the differences and similarities between arcing, beating, and electrical activity and why they're important?
Sure. And we have a whole hour on this, but I'll make this quick. So heat can damage copper by melting it. So with solid copper wiring, which would be typical on branch wiring, in the branch wiring we're typically looking at like number 14, number 12, number 10. Usually with an arc, there's a sharp line of demarcation and there's certain characteristics. If we get beading on a solid copper wire, then we want to determine, is that a potential arc, which it could be, but oftentimes it's due to melt. It's not due to arcing. On smaller stranded copper wiring, we typically get beading. So I have seen numerous times investigators have called beading arcing, when in fact it's actually something from heating. So it is very important to determine electrical activity or thermal.
And when we say electrical activity, would that be arcing or beating? How would you describe that?
I would describe that as arcing, and then the beading would need to be something that could be due to arcing or it could be due to a thermal event. So I would describe them differently. Arcing has, on certain types of wiring, a particular pattern that one looks for. Beading does too, but again, if beading's on solid copper conductors, even though one may call that arcing, very often it's different. It's thermal.
Electrical fire expert opinions are often based on the determination of whether arcing that is discovered is a victim of the fire or the cause of the fire. Do you generally find that to be an easy determination to make, and why?
Generally, arcing, just so everyone's aware, is a victim. If it is not a victim and cause, then we have to determine, as I mentioned earlier, how did we get sufficient energy? What was the first fuel ignited? Usually you have a fuel load where there's wiring. So it's really going back and making sure that the time that the arcing event went on was long enough to support ignition. And again, from numerous tests, research, structural wiring, if installed, designed, and protected properly, typically doesn't cause fires. They're more related to undersized wiring and cords.
Can you please tell us a little bit more about branch circuits and overcurrent protection in a home?
Yes, so branch circuits have been protected with fuses and breakers for years. And the older style breakers are called TM breakers, thermomagnetic. If I have a 20 amp breaker, it'll trip instantaneously at, let's say, 100 amps or about 10 times its rating. When you start having less current, but it's over 20 amps, there's actually a time current curve in which it'll trip on its thermal mechanism. Newer breakers, which we call AFCI breakers, arc fault breakers, those also look at arc characteristics, include solid state devices, which will cause those breakers to trip. The developers of those breakers primarily created them because of causes of fire related to cords. And in fact, the testing they do at the breaker manufacturer involves testing these breakers with cords to make sure they trip within a time limit as described in the UL standard.
So, if you had to describe the basic difference between installing an AFCI versus a standard thermal magnetic circuit breaker, how would you describe that?
Well, most areas of a house need AFCI protection. In 2005, you only had to do the bedrooms. And then I believe in 2008 and on, required more and more rooms. If you go into a house now, 70-80% of the breakers are likely AFCI. They do a great job in protecting the home against damaged or misused extension cords, cords to lamps, and other types of cords that you might have laying on the floor that can be damaged or pinched against material that can be ignited easily.
So often in the subrogation field, we hear that the cause of a house fire is old structural wiring. Is that accurate in your opinion?
So, working on old structural wiring, the answer is typically you're looking at what we'll call knob and tube. It was a wiring system consisting of two wires. They weren't grounded systems. They didn't include a grounding conductor, just what we'll call a phase conductor in a neutral. They are separated by air, and we call it knob and tube because when they penetrate joists, they go through a tube, and there's knobs where they're supported and connected. That wiring method is actually very robust, and it's very difficult to get that to fail and cause a fire. Fires were typically caused by putting in combustible insulation over the wiring and having fuses of too large a size. That was done through a lot of weatherization programs. And actually, I was involved with those weatherization programs when I worked for the state of PA a long time ago, and recommended against the use of cellulose insulation in insulating old homes. So the wiring system itself is very safe. It's when it's been modified by improper overcurrent protection, insulation, and then sometimes you'll see people wrap a splice on that wire and you'll get a bad splice and you'll get something called a high resistance connection where you'll get a lot of heat at the connection. And if there's something combustible there, it can ignite that material.
So, in your opinion, in your experience, what are the most typical causes of residential electrical fires?
Doing some manufacturers work, one of the issues I've seen is with dehumidifiers. They've had a long history of fire issues. Some of the other items are refrigeration equipment, and there were some room mounted humidifiers that are a problem. Today, what we see most frequently is lithium ion battery fires from such things as hoverboards, e-bikes, and laptop computers, and devices that use these batteries on a regular basis.
And if we're looking at fires that originate with some type of electrical wiring, would it be more likely that it's an extension cord fire as opposed to a structural wiring fire in your experience?
Way more likely. Again, structural wiring, even under 921, if you look at structural wiring, it is not something that is causing fires very often. In fact, structural wiring, again, is something that rarely causes fires. The fires are usually from extension cords, and particularly when somebody uses a very inexpensive extension cord, let's say a 25-foot cord that's a relatively small gauge or size, and they plug in an electric heater, because not only can an extension cord cause a fire through damage to the cord, but you could put a load on that cord that's sufficiently large to cause overheating, particularly if they take that cord and bundle it up and then throw it under some material that insulates it.
Well, Bert, thank you very much for joining us today and for sharing your expertise. To our audience, please keep an eye out for the next episode in our series about investigating residential electrical fires, where we're going to take a deeper dive into arcing and arc mapping. Bert, do you have any final remarks you'd like to say?
No, I think we covered everything I wanted to today, but thank you.
Thank you very much, and we'll see you in the next episode of Subro Sessions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Subro Sessions. Be sure to listen to the next episode of Subro Sessions, which will be released on the third Tuesday of next month, February 20th in this case. You can find past episodes of the podcast and relevant case updates on the Subrogation Strategist blog, all available at whiteandwilliams.com.
We would like to remind everyone that the contents of this podcast should not be construed as legal advice or to give a legal opinion on any specific facts or circumstances. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. The contents of this podcast are intended for general informational purposes only, and you are urged to consult a lawyer concerning your own situation with any specific legal question you may have.